30 side dishes showed up on every American Thanksgiving table in the 1950s.
Cover the pan tightly and simmer. Better fix plenty.
Your grandmother made them. Your great-grandmother perfected them.
Now we just need to slowly fold in the flour, dear.
They were in Betty Crocker's Thanksgiving Cookbook, handwritten on recipe cards and passed down through generations. But today, you won't find a single one at your Thanksgiving dinner. We replaced them with green bean casserole from a can and store-bought dinner rolls.
It's important to stir it thoroughly, dear.
Oh, I'm doing my best, Mom.
These weren't basic sides. They were dishes that took skill, cost less than $3 to make, and tasted better than anything you'll find at a modern Thanksgiving table. They vanished completely by the 1980s. We're bringing back all 30. Scalloped oysters was the side dish that separated fancy Thanksgiving dinners from regular ones. In the 1950s, if scalloped oysters showed up on the table, you knew the family had money, or at least wanted everyone to think they did. Betty Crocker's recipe was deceptively simple: fresh oysters layered with crushed crackers, butter, cream, and a touch of Worcestershire sauce, baked until golden and bubbling. The dish originated in coastal regions where oysters were cheap and abundant, but by the 1950s it had become a nationwide Thanksgiving tradition. The oysters were briny and rich, the crackers added crunch, and the cream made everything luxurious. You served it in individual ramekins or one large casserole dish, and it was always the first side dish to disappear from the table. Here's what made scalloped oysters special. The oysters cooked just enough to stay tender but not rubbery. The cracker topping got crispy and golden. The cream sauce absorbed all the oyster flavor. Every bite was a combination of textures: creamy, crunchy, briny, and rich. In the 1950s, a quart of fresh oysters cost about 50 cents, which made this an affordable luxury. Scalloped oysters disappeared in the 1970s when oysters became expensive and harder to find. Pollution destroyed oyster beds along the East Coast, and prices skyrocketed. By the 1980s, fresh oysters were a luxury item, and most families couldn't justify spending $20 on a side dish. The recipe vanished from Thanksgiving tables and stayed gone. Creamed onions sounds boring until you taste it. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used small pearl onions, the tiny white onions about the size of a marble, cooked until tender, then smothered in a rich cream sauce made with butter, flour, milk, and nutmeg. The result was a side dish that was sweet, savory, creamy, and completely addictive. In the 1950s, creamed onions was a Thanksgiving staple. Every grandmother made it. The dish was popular because pearl onions were cheap and available at every grocery store. You'd buy a bag for 25 cents, peel them, which took forever. More on that in a second. Boil them until soft, and make the cream sauce while they cooled. The flavor of creamed onions is hard to describe if you've never had it. Pearl onions are much sweeter and milder than regular onions. When cooked, they turn soft and almost buttery. The cream sauce is rich and velvety, and the nutmeg adds a warm, slightly spicy note that makes the whole dish taste like Thanksgiving. You'd serve it in a bowl next to the turkey, and people would pile it onto their plates alongside the stuffing and mashed potatoes. Here's the catch: peeling pearl onions is a nightmare. Each onion is tiny, and the skin clings to the flesh. In the 1950s, grandmothers had a trick. Blanch the onions in boiling water for 30 seconds, then plunge them into ice water. The skins slip right off. But even with the trick, peeling 2 pounds of pearl onions took 20 minutes. Sweet potato puff is what happens when you take mashed sweet potatoes and turn them into something that looks like a souffle but tastes like Thanksgiving heaven. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe whipped sweet potatoes with butter, brown sugar, eggs, and a hint of cinnamon, then baked the mixture until it puffed up and turned golden on top. The result was a side dish that was light, airy, sweet and savory all at once. In the 1950s, sweet potato puff was the elegant version of sweet potato casserole. Instead of marshmallows and streusel topping, which didn't become popular until the 1960s, this dish relied on technique. The eggs were beaten until fluffy, then folded into the sweet potato mixture, which created air pockets that expanded during baking. The top turned crispy and caramelized, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The genius of sweet potato puff was its versatility. It wasn't as sweet as dessert, but it was sweeter than a typical side dish. It paired perfectly with turkey and gravy because the sweetness balanced the savory flavors. And it looked impressive. When you pulled it out of the oven, it was tall and golden, like a French soufflé. Sweet potato puff disappeared in the 1960s when the marshmallow-topped sweet potato casserole took over. That version was easier to make. No beating eggs, no folding, just mash and top with marshmallows. Harvard beets are one of those dishes that sound weird but taste incredible. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe cooked beets until tender, then tossed them in a sweet and sour glaze made from sugar, vinegar, butter, and cornstarch. The result was a side dish that was tangy, sweet, earthy, and visually stunning, bright magenta beets glistening in a glossy sauce. In the 1950s, Harvard beets were a Thanksgiving staple, especially in New England where the dish originated. The name supposedly comes from the crimson color, which matched Harvard University's school colors. Whether that's true or not, the dish was everywhere during the holidays. Grandmothers would cook fresh beets, slice them into rounds, and coat them in the glaze. The beets were served warm, and they added a pop of color to the Thanksgiving table. The flavor of Harvard beets is polarizing. People either love them or hate them. The vinegar gives them a sharp tanginess, the sugar adds sweetness, and the beets themselves taste earthy and slightly metallic. But when everything comes together, the dish is balanced and delicious. The sweet and sour combination cuts through the richness of turkey and gravy, which makes Harvard beets a palate cleanser. Harvard beets disappeared in the 1970s when beets fell out of fashion. By the 1980s, most Americans associated beets with cheap canned vegetables that tasted like dirt. Fresh beets were seen as old-fashioned, and Harvard beets vanished along with them. Celery amandine is proof that you can make anything delicious if you add enough butter and almonds. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe braised celery stalks in chicken broth until tender, then topped them with toasted slivered almonds and browned butter. The result was a side dish that was crunchy, nutty, rich, and surprisingly elegant. In the 1950s, celery amandine was considered fancy. The word amandine is French for with almonds, and anything French was sophisticated in post-war America. The dish was popular at holiday dinners because celery was cheap and available year-round, but the almonds and butter made it feel special. The brilliance of celery amandine was its simplicity. You cut celery into sticks, braised them in broth until they were just tender, not mushy, then topped them with almonds that had been toasted in butter until golden and fragrant. The celery stayed crunchy, but absorbed the chicken broth flavor. The almonds added texture and nuttiness. The browned butter tied everything together with its rich, almost caramel-like taste. Celery amandine disappeared in the 1970s when vegetable sides became less important on American tables. The focus shifted to casseroles and starches, and simple vegetable preparations like celery amandine were forgotten. By the 1980s, celery was relegated to crudité platters and Bloody Marys. Nobody was braising it anymore. Succotash is one of the oldest American side dishes, dating back to Native American cooking, but it reached peak popularity in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe combined lima beans and corn, the traditional base, then added butter, cream, and sometimes bacon or salt pork. The result was a side dish that was creamy, sweet, smoky, and hearty. In the 1950s, succotash was a Thanksgiving staple because it used simple, affordable ingredients. Lima beans and corn were pantry staples. Most families used canned or frozen, and the dish came together in about 20 minutes. You'd sauté the vegetables in butter, add cream, season with salt and pepper, and serve it hot. Some versions included diced red bell peppers for color, and others added bacon for smokiness. The flavor of succotash depends entirely on the quality of the ingredients. Fresh lima beans and corn make the dish sweet and vibrant. Frozen vegetables make it bland and mushy. In the 1950s, most families used frozen vegetables because they were convenient, which meant succotash tasted good but not great. The best versions, made with fresh vegetables during summer and fall, were incredible. Succotash disappeared in the 1980s when lima beans fell out of favor. People started calling them butter beans, which they are, but even the rebranding didn't help. Lima beans were seen as mushy, boring, and cafeteria food. By the 1990s, succotash was gone from most Thanksgiving tables. Giblet gravy is the OG turkey gravy, and it's nothing like the smooth, bland gravy most people make today. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used the turkey giblets, the heart, liver, gizzard, and neck, simmered in broth until tender, then chopped and added to a thick, rich gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and broth. The result was a gravy with chunks of meat, deep flavor, and a texture that was hearty, not slick. In the 1950s, giblet gravy was standard at every Thanksgiving dinner. Wasting any part of the turkey was unthinkable, and the giblets were considered a delicacy. Grandmothers would simmer them for hours while the turkey roasted, creating a broth that became the base for the gravy. The chopped giblets added meatiness and texture, and the liver gave the gravy a slightly earthy, iron-rich flavor. The genius of giblet gravy was that it used every part of the bird. Nothing went to waste. The neck added collagen, which made the gravy silky. The heart and gizzard added texture. The liver added depth. When you poured giblet gravy over turkey and mashed potatoes, you were getting maximum flavor from every part of the animal. Giblet gravy disappeared in the 1980s when people stopped wanting weird parts of the bird. The liver, in particular, became controversial. People found its flavor too strong and its texture off-putting. By the 1990s, most families threw the giblets away or fed them to the dog. Smooth, plain gravy became the standard, but giblet gravy is better. It has more flavor, more body, and more character than basic gravy. If you've never had it, the liver might seem intimidating, but when chopped finely and mixed with the other giblets, it just adds richness. The recipe costs nothing extra. You're using parts that come with the turkey, and it takes about 2 hours. Most of that is simmering. Betty Crocker's giblet gravy recipe is the traditional way, and it's worth trying at least once. 7 side dishes down, 23 to go. And if you're noticing a pattern, you're right. Every single one of these dishes was a Thanksgiving staple in the 1950s. And every single one vanished because we stopped valuing real cooking. We traded homemade for convenience, and we lost flavor in the process.
Now this is a very easy recipe, and it's an all-year-round recipe.
But here's the thing. These dishes aren't hard to make. They're just old-fashioned. And old-fashioned isn't bad. It's usually better. The next set of dishes gets even more forgotten. These are the sides that only show up in handwritten recipe cards and dusty Betty Crocker cookbooks. Let's keep going. Turnip puff is basically the turnip version of sweet potato puff, and it's one of the most underrated side dishes in American cooking history. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe mashed cooked turnips with butter, eggs, sugar, and nutmeg, then baked the mixture until it puffed up and turned golden. The result was a side dish that was slightly sweet, earthy, and surprisingly light. In the 1950s, turnip puff was popular in rural areas where turnips grew easily and cheaply. Turnip turnips were considered a humble vegetable, something poor farmers grew because it thrived in bad soil. But when prepared correctly, they were delicious. The bitterness of raw turnips disappeared during cooking, leaving behind a sweet, slightly peppery flavor. The genius of turnip puff was how it transformed a vegetable most people hated into something elegant. The eggs made it fluffy. The sugar balanced the earthiness. The nutmeg added warmth. When you served turnip puff at Thanksgiving, guests who claimed they hated turnips would ask for seconds. Turnip puff disappeared when turnips themselves fell out of favor. By the 1970s, turnips were seen as Depression-era food, something you ate when you couldn't afford anything better. Younger generations associated turnips with poverty and refused to cook with them. By the 1980s, turnip puff was gone, but turnips are cheap, nutritious, and actually delicious when prepared correctly. Turnip puff costs about $4 to make: turnips, eggs, butter, sugar, and feeds 8 people. It's also a great option for people who want a lower-carb alternative to sweet potatoes. Betty Crocker's recipe is foolproof. Parsnip fritters are fried patties made from grated parsnips, eggs, flour, and seasoning, pan-fried until crispy and golden. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe created fritters that were crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and tasted like a cross between hash browns and sweet potato pancakes. In the 1950s, parsnip fritters were a Thanksgiving side dish that showcased skill. Making fritters required technique: grating the parsnips finely, squeezing out excess moisture, binding them with just enough egg and flour, and frying them at the right temperature so they crisped up without burning. When done correctly, the fritters were golden and lacy around the edges, crispy and satisfying. The flavor of parsnips is unique. They're sweeter than potatoes, but earthier than carrots, with a slightly nutty taste. When fried, they caramelize and develop a complex sweetness. The crispy edges are the best part: crunchy, salty, and addictive. Parsnip fritters disappeared when parsnips fell out of favor in American cooking. By the 1970s, most grocery stores didn't even stock parsnips regularly. They were seen as old-fashioned, and younger cooks didn't know how to use them. By the 1980s, parsnip fritters were completely forgotten, but parsnips are back. They're showing up at farmers markets and trendy restaurants, usually roasted or pureed into soup. Parsnip fritters deserve a comeback, too. The recipe costs about $5. Parsnips, eggs, flour, oil. Takes 30 minutes and makes about 12 fritters. They're crispy, delicious, and completely different from any other side dish on a modern Thanksgiving table. Betty Crocker's recipe still works. Broccoli ring mold is one of those dishes that looks impressive but is secretly easy to make. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined cooked broccoli with eggs, breadcrumbs, and butter, pressed the mixture into a ring mold, baked it until set, then unmolded it onto a platter and filled the center with cheese sauce. The result was a side dish that looked like something from a fancy restaurant. In the 1950s, ring molds were everywhere. Families owned ring-shaped pans specifically for making molded dishes, and anything that came out of a mold was considered elegant. Broccoli ring. Mold was a Thanksgiving showpiece. The bright green ring with golden cheese sauce in the center looked festive and impressive. The flavor was simple but satisfying. The broccoli was tender and slightly nutty from baking. The breadcrumbs added texture. The cheese sauce was rich and creamy, made from butter, flour, milk, and sharp cheddar. When you served it, you'd cut slices of the broccoli ring and drizzle cheese sauce over each portion. Broccoli ring mold disappeared when molded dishes fell out of fashion in the 1970s. Aspic, gelatin salads, and molded vegetable dishes were suddenly seen as dated and uncool. By the 1980s, ring molds were relegated to thrift stores, and nobody was making molded vegetables anymore. But broccoli ring mold is actually good. It's not some weird retro experiment. It's a practical way to serve broccoli that looks fancy with minimal effort. You can find vintage ring molds online for about $10, and the recipe costs about $8. Broccoli, cheese, breadcrumbs, eggs. It feeds 8 people and makes a statement. Betty Crocker's recipe is solid. Waldorf salad is one of the few dishes on this list that most people have heard of, but almost nobody makes anymore. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined diced apples, celery, walnuts, and grapes, all tossed in a mayonnaise-based dressing. The result was a side dish that was crunchy, sweet, tangy, and refreshing. The salad originated at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City in the 1890s, and by the 1950s it had become an American classic. It showed up at Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas parties, and potlucks. The beauty of Waldorf salad was its simplicity. You chopped fruit and vegetables, mixed them with mayo, and served it cold. No cooking required. The flavor of Waldorf salad is hard to describe if you've never had it. The apples are crisp and slightly tart. The celery adds crunch and a mild vegetal flavor. The walnuts add richness and a slight bitterness. The grapes add sweetness and juiciness. The mayonnaise ties everything together with its creamy, tangy coating. When done right, Waldorf salad is balanced and refreshing, a palate cleanser between bites of heavy turkey and stuffing. Waldorf salad disappeared when fruit salads in general fell out of fashion. By the 1980s, the combination of fruit and mayonnaise was seen as weird and outdated. Younger generations couldn't understand why anyone would mix apples with mayo. By the 1990s, Waldorf salad was a punchline, but Waldorf salad is good. The key is using crisp, tart apples, like Granny Smith, fresh celery, and high-quality mayonnaise. The salad costs about $6 to make and feeds 8 people. It's also easy to customize. Some versions use yogurt instead of mayo or add dried cranberries for extra sweetness. Betty Crocker's classic recipe is a good starting point. Carrot ring with peas is another molded dish, and it's even more impressive than broccoli ring mold. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe pureed cooked carrots with eggs, butter, and breadcrumbs, packed the mixture into a ring mold, baked it until set, then unmolded it and filled the center with buttered peas. The result was a side dish with stunning color contrast, bright orange carrots surrounding vibrant green peas. In the 1950s, carrot ring with peas was a holiday centerpiece. The colors were festive, the presentation was elegant, and the dish was practical. It served vegetables in a visually appealing way. Grandmothers would make this for Thanksgiving and Christmas because it looked fancy but didn't require expensive ingredients. The flavor was mild and comforting. The carrot ring was slightly sweet and soft, almost like a savory carrot cake without sugar. The peas were buttery and tender. When you cut a slice of the carrot ring and spooned peas over it, you got a complete vegetable side in one bite. The recipe costs about $5. Carrots, peas, eggs, butter, breadcrumbs, and feeds 8 people. Creamed spinach is still around today, but Betty Crocker's 1950s version was different. It included chopped hard-boiled eggs mixed into the spinach and cream sauce. The eggs added protein, texture, and a richness that plain creamed spinach lacks. In the 1950s, creamed spinach with hard-boiled eggs was a Thanksgiving side that stretched the dish and made it more substantial. Spinach was cheap, eggs were cheap, and cream sauce made everything taste good. You'd cook fresh spinach, or use frozen, make a bechamel sauce with butter, flour, and milk, chop hard-boiled eggs, and fold everything together. The result was creamy, rich, and hearty. The eggs were the secret weapon. They added little pockets of richness throughout the spinach, and the yolks dissolved slightly into the cream sauce, making it even thicker and more flavorful. The dish was served hot, and it paired perfectly with turkey and mashed potatoes. Creamed spinach with hard-boiled eggs disappeared when eggs in vegetables became unfashionable. Fried apples are a Southern Thanksgiving tradition that most people outside the South have never heard of. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe sliced apples, usually tart varieties like Granny Smith, fried them in butter and brown sugar until caramelized, then seasoned them with cinnamon. The result was a side dish that was sweet, tangy, and almost dessert-like, but still belonged on the dinner table. In the 1950s, fried apples were popular in Appalachia and the rural South, where apples were abundant and cheap. The dish was practical. It used up apples that were too tart to eat raw, and it required minimal ingredients. You'd heat butter in a cast-iron skillet, add sliced apples, sprinkle brown sugar over them, and cook until they softened and caramelized. The edges would turn golden and slightly crispy, while the centers stayed tender. The flavor of fried apples is incredible. The butter and brown sugar caramelize together, coating the apples in a sweet, sticky glaze. The cinnamon adds warmth. The apples themselves retain some tartness, which balances the sweetness. Fried apples disappeared when Southern cooking in general became less popular in mainstream America. By the 1980s, most people outside the South had never heard of fried apples, and even in the South, the dish was fading. Canned apple pie filling became a convenient substitute, and the tradition of frying fresh apples was lost. But fried apples are easy to make and incredibly delicious. The recipe costs about $4. Apples, butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, takes 20 minutes and feeds 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and foolproof. Hominy casserole is a Southern dish that never made it mainstream, but it should have. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined canned hominy, dried corn kernels treated with lye, which makes them puff up and turn white, with cheese, butter, sour cream, and green chilies, then baked everything until bubbly and golden. In the 1950s, hominy casserole was popular in the Southwest and rural South, where hominy was a pantry staple. The dish was cheap, filling, and easy to make. Open a can of hominy, mix it with cheese and sour cream, bake it, done. The hominy had a unique texture, softer than whole corn, but with a slight chew, and a mild, slightly alkaline flavor that paired well with sharp cheddar and spicy chilies. The genius of hominy casserole was how versatile it was. It was a side dish that adapted to whatever you had in the pantry. Hominy casserole disappeared when hominy itself became harder to find outside the South. By the 1970s, most grocery stores in the North and Midwest didn't carry canned hominy. By the 1980s, the dish was completely regional, and even in the South, it was fading. But hominy is available online and at most Mexican grocery stores. Hominy casserole costs about $7 to make hominy, cheese, sour cream, chilies, and feeds 8 people. It's also naturally gluten-free, which makes it appealing to modern dietary preferences. Betty Crocker's recipe is a hidden gem. Glazed carrots with honey and butter is one of the simplest side dishes on this list, but it's also one of the best. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe cooked sliced carrots in water until tender, then tossed them in a glaze made from honey, butter, and a pinch of salt. The result was carrots that were sweet, buttery, glossy, and absolutely delicious. In the 1950s, glazed carrots were a Thanksgiving staple because they were easy, cheap, and universally liked. Even kids who hated vegetables would eat glazed carrots because they tasted like candy. The honey caramelized slightly during cooking, coating the carrots in a sticky, sweet glaze. Betty Crocker's recipe nailed the balance. Just enough honey to make them sweet, just enough butter to make them rich. Glazed carrots disappeared when vegetable sides became more elaborate in the 1980s. Simple preparations like boiled and glazed vegetables were seen as boring, but simplicity is underrated. Glazed carrots cost about $3. Carrots, honey, butter take 20 minutes to make and feed 8 people. They're easy, reliable, and taste better than most complicated vegetable sides. Betty Crocker's recipe is perfect as is. Corn pudding is a Southern classic that sits somewhere between a side dish and a casserole. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined fresh corn kernels, or canned creamed corn, with eggs, milk, butter, sugar, and a bit of flour, then baked the mixture until it set into a custard-like pudding. The result was sweet, creamy, and incredibly rich. In the 1950s, corn pudding was a Thanksgiving staple in the South and Midwest. It was popular because it transformed simple ingredients into something special. The eggs and milk created a custard base that was smooth and velvety. The corn added sweetness and texture. The butter made everything rich. When you scooped corn pudding onto your plate, it was soft and slightly jiggly, like a savory flan. The genius of corn pudding was its adaptability. You could make it with fresh corn during summer and fall, or use canned creamed corn year-round. You could make it sweet by adding extra sugar, or make it savory by adding cheese and peppers. It was a forgiving recipe that always turned out good. Corn pudding disappeared when casseroles became less popular in the 1980s. The dish was seen as too heavy, too old-fashioned, and too Southern. By the 1990s, it was rare outside of traditional Southern Thanksgiving dinners, but corn pudding is incredible. It's rich, comforting, and has a unique texture that's unlike any other side dish. The recipe costs about $6, corn, eggs, milk, butter, sugar, and feeds 8 people. Betty Crocker's version is the classic. Braised celery hearts is the fancy version of celery amandine. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe used whole celery hearts, the tender inner stalks, braised them in chicken or beef broth with butter until soft, then served them with the reduced braising liquid as a sauce. The result was a side dish that was elegant, flavorful, and surprisingly meaty for a vegetable. In the 1950s, braised celery hearts was considered a restaurant-quality dish. It showed up at holiday dinners when families wanted to impress guests. The celery hearts were tender and absorbed all the flavor from the broth and butter. The reduced sauce was rich and glossy. The dish looked beautiful on the plate. Pale green celery hearts in a pool of golden sauce. The flavor of braised celery is completely different from raw celery. Raw celery is crunchy and slightly bitter. Braised celery is soft, sweet, and almost buttery. The broth adds depth, and the butter adds richness. When you cut into a braised celery heart, it's tender all the way through, and every bite is infused with flavor. Braised celery. Hearts disappeared when elaborate vegetable preparations fell out of fashion in the 1970s. Braising vegetables was seen as too time-consuming and too old school. By the 1980s, roasted vegetables became the standard, and braised vegetables were forgotten. Braising is a superior technique for celery. It transforms a boring vegetable into something luxurious. The recipe costs about $5, celery hearts, broth, butter, and takes 40 minutes. It's also elegant enough to serve at a fancy dinner party. Betty Crocker's recipe is restaurant quality. Baked acorn squash with maple syrup is one of the most visually appealing side dishes in Betty Crocker's 1950s cookbook. The recipe halved acorn squash, scooped out the seeds, filled each half with butter and maple syrup, then baked them until the flesh was tender and caramelized. The result was a side dish that looked beautiful and tasted like Thanksgiving in squash form. In the 1950s, baked acorn squash was a Thanksgiving staple, because acorn squash was cheap and available everywhere. One squash cost about 20 cents and served 2 people. The dish was simple to make: cut, fill, bake, and it looked impressive on the table. The dark green skin contrasted with the bright orange flesh, and the maple syrup glaze made everything glossy and inviting. The flavor of acorn squash with maple syrup is sweet and earthy. The squash itself has a mild, slightly nutty flavor that becomes sweeter when roasted. The maple syrup caramelizes during baking, creating a sticky, sweet glaze. The butter adds richness and helps the squash stay moist. When you scooped out a bite, you got tender squash coated in maple butter. Baked acorn. Squash disappeared when butternut squash became more popular in the 1980s. Butternut squash was easier to peel and had a smoother texture, which made it more appealing for soups and purees. Acorn squash was seen as outdated and harder to work with. By the 1990s, most people had switched to butternut squash, and acorn squash was forgotten. But acorn squash with maple syrup is better for roasting because the squash holds its shape and has a more interesting flavor. The recipe costs about $8, acorn squash, maple syrup, butter, and feeds 8 people. 4 squashes, have. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and foolproof. Mushroom timbales are individual molded mushroom custards that look fancy but are surprisingly easy to make. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe sautéed mushrooms with butter and shallots, mixed them with eggs and cream, poured the mixture into individual ramekins, and baked them in a water bath until set. The result was a side dish that was rich, earthy, and restaurant quality. In the 1950s, mushroom timbales were a special occasion side dish. They required individual ramekins and a water bath, which made them seem complicated. But the actual process was simple. The timbales were served unmolded onto plates, and they held their shape perfectly. The texture was silky and custard-like, and the mushroom flavor was concentrated and intense. The genius of mushroom timbales was their elegance. They looked like something from a French restaurant, but they were made with simple ingredients: mushrooms, eggs, cream, butter. When you unmolded a timbale onto a plate and placed it next to turkey and stuffing, it elevated the entire meal. Mushroom timbales disappeared when elaborate side dishes fell out of fashion in the 1970s. Molded dishes, in particular, were seen as too fussy and too retro. By the 1980s, timbales of any kind were rare, and mushroom timbales were forgotten. But mushroom timbales are impressive and not as hard to make as they look. The recipe costs about $10, 20 dishes down, 10 to go. And we're getting into the truly forgotten territory now, the sides that even vintage cooking enthusiasts might not know. These are the regional specialties, the dishes that only appeared in specific editions of Betty Crocker's cookbook, the ones that required ingredients you can barely find today. But every single one is worth making. Every single one was on American Thanksgiving tables in the 1950s, and every single one deserves a comeback. Let's finish strong. Salsify is a root vegetable that looks like a dirty white carrot and tastes like a cross between artichoke hearts and oysters. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe peeled and boiled salsify until tender, then served it in a cream sauce made with butter, flour, milk, and parsley. The result was a side dish that was creamy, slightly sweet, and had a unique flavor that most people had never tasted. In the 1950s, salsify was popular in rural areas where it grew wild. It was also called oyster plant because of its vaguely seafood-like flavor. Families would harvest salsify in the fall, peel it, which was tedious, the roots were long and thin, boil it, and serve it in cream sauce. The dish was mild and comforting, perfect for Thanksgiving. Salsify in cream sauce disappeared when salsify itself became nearly impossible to find. By the 1970s, grocery stores didn't carry it, and seed companies stopped selling it. The vegetable was forgotten outside of specialty farms and historical cooking circles. By the 1980s, most Americans had never heard of salsify. But salsify is making a tiny comeback at farmers' markets and specialty grocers. If you can find it, salsify in cream sauce costs about $8 to make and feeds 8 people. The flavor is unique and worth trying at least once. Betty Crocker's recipe is one of the few places you'll find instructions for cooking salsify. Creamed peas and new potatoes is one of the most comforting side dishes in Betty Crocker's 1950s cookbook. The recipe combined small new potatoes, boiled until tender, with fresh or frozen peas, all tossed in a cream sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and a touch of nutmeg. The result was a side dish that was creamy, hearty, and tasted like spring and fall at the same time. In the 1950s, creamed peas and new potatoes was a Thanksgiving and Easter staple. The dish was popular because it was filling. The potatoes made it substantial enough to be a main course for vegetarians, and the cream sauce made everything rich and satisfying. The peas added sweetness and color, and the potatoes added heft. The genius of this dish was its simplicity. You boiled potatoes and peas, made a quick cream sauce, combined everything, and served it hot. The cream sauce coated every potato and pea, and the nutmeg added a subtle warmth that tied the dish together. Creamed peas and new potatoes disappeared when cream-based sides fell out of favor in the 1980s. In the 1950s, rutabaga was a Thanksgiving staple in cold-weather states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Maine. The vegetable grew well in harsh climates, and it stored for months in root cellars. Families would mash rutabaga with butter and serve it alongside turkey and mashed potatoes. The flavor was similar to turnips, but sweeter and less bitter. The key to good buttered rutabaga was using enough butter. Rutabaga can be dry and slightly woody if undercooked or underseasoned, but when cooked until very tender and mashed with plenty of butter, it becomes smooth, creamy, and delicious. The black pepper adds a subtle spice that balances the sweetness. Buttered rutabaga disappeared when rutabaga fell out of favor in the 1970s. Like turnips, rutabaga was associated with poverty and Depression-era cooking. By the 1980s, most Americans had never tasted rutabaga, and grocery stores stopped carrying it regularly. But rutabaga is cheap, nutritious, and actually tasty. Buttered rutabaga costs about $4 to make. Rutabaga, butter, pepper, and feeds 8 people. It's also lower in carbs than mashed potatoes, which makes it appealing to modern diets. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and reliable. Spiced crab apples are a sweet and tangy side dish that most people have never heard of. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe simmered whole crab apples in a syrup made from sugar, vinegar, cinnamon, and cloves until the apples were tender and the syrup was thick. The result was a side dish that looked beautiful. Bright red apples in glossy syrup, and tasted like a cross between pickles and dessert. In the 1950s, spiced crab apples were a Thanksgiving garnish. They were served in a bowl next to the turkey, and guests would take 1 or 2 and place them on their plates. The apples were sweet, tangy, and spiced, and they paired surprisingly well with savory foods. The tartness cut through the richness of turkey and gravy, and the spices echoed the flavors of pumpkin pie. The genius of spiced crab apples was how they combined sweet and sour in one bite. The sugar made them sweet, the vinegar made them tangy, and the spices made them warm and aromatic. They were also beautiful. The red skin stayed intact during cooking, and the apples looked like jewels in their syrup. Spiced crab apples disappeared when crab apples themselves became hard to find. By the 1970s, crab apple trees were mostly ornamental, and grocery stores didn't sell crab apples for cooking. By the 1980s, the dish was completely forgotten. But crab apples are still out there. Check farmers' markets in the fall. Spiced crab apples cost about $6 to make. Crab apples, sugar, vinegar, spices, and serve 8 people, 1 or 2 apples per person. They're also a great way to use up crab apples if you have a tree. Betty Crocker's recipe is a hidden gem. Sweet and sour red cabbage is a German-inspired side dish that became popular in American Thanksgiving dinners in the 1950s. Betty Crocker's recipe braised red cabbage with apples, onions, vinegar, sugar, and bacon until the cabbage was tender and the flavors melded together. The result was a side dish that was tangy, sweet, savory, and deeply flavorful. In the 1950s, sweet and sour red cabbage was especially popular in Midwestern states with large German immigrant populations. The dish was practical. Red cabbage was cheap and stored well, and the recipe could be made a day ahead and reheated. The cabbage turned a deep purple color during cooking, and the vinegar and sugar created a complex sweet and sour flavor. The genius of sweet and sour red cabbage was how it balanced contrasting flavors. The vinegar made it tangy, the sugar made it sweet, the bacon added smokiness, and the apples added fruitiness. Every bite was complex and interesting. The dish also improved with age. It tasted even better the next day after the flavors had time to meld. Sweet and sour red cabbage disappeared when German-American cuisine in general became less popular. By the 1980s, most Americans associated red cabbage with coleslaw or pickled vegetables, and the braised version was forgotten. But sweet and sour red cabbage is delicious. It's tangy, hearty, and pairs perfectly with rich foods like turkey and ham. The recipe costs about $7. Red cabbage, apples, bacon, vinegar, sugar, and feeds 8 people. It also keeps for days in the fridge. Betty Crocker's recipe is a classic. Chestnut stuffing is what stuffing becomes when you add roasted chestnuts to the mix. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe combined bread cubes, celery, onions, butter, and chopped roasted chestnuts, then moistened everything with chicken broth and baked it until golden. The result was stuffing that was nutty, rich, slightly sweet, and completely different from regular bread stuffing. In the 1950s, chestnut stuffing was a luxury Thanksgiving side. Chestnuts were expensive, they still are, and adding them to stuffing was a way to show guests you spared no expense. The chestnuts added a meaty texture and a sweet, nutty flavor that elevated basic bread stuffing into something special. The genius of chestnut stuffing was how the chestnuts absorbed the broth and butter, becoming soft and creamy while still retaining their shape. Every bite of stuffing had chunks of chestnut that added texture and flavor. The stuffing was rich and satisfying, almost like a meal on its own. Chestnut stuffing disappeared when chestnuts became prohibitively expensive and hard to find. The American chestnut blight wiped out most chestnut trees in the U.S., and importing chestnuts became costly. By the 1980s, chestnut stuffing was a rarity, but chestnuts are available online and at specialty stores during the holidays. Pre-roasted, peeled chestnuts cost about $12 a jar, which makes chestnut stuffing expensive, around $20 total. But it's worth it for a special Thanksgiving. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic version. Topping baked tomatoes with breadcrumb topping is a simple side dish that looks and tastes fancy. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe halved fresh tomatoes, topped them with a mixture of breadcrumbs, butter, Parmesan cheese, and herbs, then baked them until the tomatoes were soft and the topping was golden and crispy. The result was a side dish that was juicy, savory, crunchy, and elegant. In the 1950s, baked tomatoes were a Thanksgiving side in regions where tomatoes were still available in November, mostly the South and California. The dish was popular because it was easy and looked impressive. The bright red tomatoes with golden breadcrumb topping added color to the Thanksgiving table. The flavor of baked tomatoes was simple but satisfying. The tomatoes released their juices during baking, which mingled with the butter and Parmesan in the breadcrumb topping. The result was a side dish that was both fresh and rich. The breadcrumbs added crunch, and the Parmesan added savory depth. Baked tomatoes disappeared when fresh tomatoes became less common at Thanksgiving. By the 1970s, most of the U.S. didn't have access to good fresh tomatoes in November, and the dish faded. By the 1980s, it was forgotten. But if you live in a warm climate or can find good tomatoes at the store, baked tomatoes are worth making. The recipe costs about $8, tomatoes, breadcrumbs, Parmesan, butter, and serves 8 people. Betty Crocker's recipe is simple and elegant. Lima beans in tomato sauce is a side dish that sounds basic but tastes incredible. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe simmered lima beans in a tomato sauce made from canned tomatoes, onions, garlic, and bacon, then seasoned everything with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar. The result was a side dish that was hearty, savory, slightly sweet, and deeply flavorful. In the 1950s, lima beans in tomato sauce was a Thanksgiving side in the South and Midwest. The dish was economical. Lima beans and canned tomatoes were pantry staples, and it was filling enough to serve as a main course for vegetarians. If you skipped the bacon, the tomato sauce was rich and tangy, and the lima beans absorbed all the flavor. The genius of this dish was how the tomato sauce transformed bland lima beans into something delicious. The onions and garlic added depth, the bacon added smokiness, and the sugar balanced the acidity of the tomatoes. The result was a side dish that was much more than the sum of its parts. Lima beans in tomato sauce disappeared when lima beans fell out of favor in the 1980s. By the 1990s, most Americans associated lima beans with school cafeterias and refused to eat them. But lima beans are good when cooked properly. Lima beans in tomato sauce costs about $6 to make. Lima beans, canned tomatoes, bacon, onions, and feeds 8 people. It's hearty, flavorful, and underrated. Betty Crocker's recipe is solid. Potato croquettes are fried balls of mashed potatoes coated in breadcrumbs and fried until golden and crispy. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe mixed mashed potatoes with egg, butter, and seasonings, shaped them into cylinders, coated them in breadcrumbs, and deep-fried them until crispy on the outside and creamy on the inside. In the 1950s, potato croquettes were a Thanksgiving side that showcased technique. Making croquettes required shaping the potatoes, coating them evenly, and frying them at the right temperature. When done correctly, they were golden, crispy, and impressive. Serving croquettes at Thanksgiving meant you had skills in the kitchen. These weren't something you could throw together at the last minute. This was where technique mattered. The potatoes had to be compressed tightly so they didn't fall apart during frying. You'd roll each cylinder between your palms, smoothing the surface and making sure there were no cracks. Then came the coating process. Roll each croquette in flour, which helped the egg wash stick, dip it in beaten egg, which acted as glue for the breadcrumbs, then roll it in fine, dry breadcrumbs until every surface was covered. The coated croquettes would rest in the refrigerator for at least an hour. This step was crucial. Chilling them firmed up the potato mixture and helped the coating adhere. When you were ready to fry, you'd heat oil to exactly 375 degrees. Too hot, and the outside would burn before the inside heated through. Too cool, and the croquettes would absorb oil and turn greasy. The frying process was dramatic. You'd carefully lower the croquettes into the hot oil. They'd sizzle immediately, bubbles rushing to the surface. After about 3 minutes, they'd turn golden brown, and you'd flip them with a slotted spoon to brown the other side. When they were evenly golden all over, you'd lift them out and drain them on paper towels. The outside would be crispy and crunchy, almost shattering when you bit into it. The inside would be hot, creamy, and perfectly seasoned. The flavor of potato croquettes was simple, mashed potatoes, but the texture was incredible. The fried breadcrumb coating was crunchy and golden, and the inside was creamy and soft. They were served hot, straight from the fryer, and they paired perfectly with turkey and gravy. Some families would hollow out the center and fill it with cheese or herbs before frying, which made them even more decadent. Potato croquettes disappeared when deep frying at home became less common in the 1980s. The dish was seen as too much work, shaping, coating, chilling, frying, and too unhealthy. Fried foods in general fell out of favor as Americans became more health-conscious. By the 1990s, croquettes of any kind were rare outside of restaurants. Mashed potatoes became the standard, served in a bowl with a pat of butter on top. Simple, safe, boring. But potato croquettes are delicious and worth the effort. Yes, they require work. Yes, they require deep frying. But the payoff is a side dish that looks and tastes restaurant quality. Kids love them because they're fun to eat. You can pick them up with your hands. Adults love them because they're crispy and indulgent. They're the kind of dish that makes people ask, "How did you make these?" The recipe costs about $8, $3 for potatoes, $2 for eggs, $2 for breadcrumbs, $1 for oil. The batch makes about 20 croquettes, which is enough to serve 8 people, with 2 or 3 croquettes per person. You can also make them ahead and freeze them after the coating step. On Thanksgiving Day, you'd fry them straight from the freezer, adding an extra minute or 2 to the cooking time. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic, but you can customize it. Mix grated cheese into the potato mixture for extra richness. Add chopped chives or parsley for color and flavor. Form them into different shapes, balls, ovals, or even flat patties if you prefer. The technique is the same, and the result is always impressive. Pickled beets and onions is the perfect side dish to end this list because it's tangy, refreshing, and cuts through the richness of Thanksgiving dinner. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe pickled cooked beets and sliced onions in a brine made from vinegar, sugar, salt, and spices, then chilled them for at least a day before serving. The result was a side dish that was bright, tangy, slightly sweet, and incredibly refreshing. In the 1950s, pickled beets and onions were a Thanksgiving staple because they could be made a week ahead and actually improved with age. The longer the vegetables sat in the brine, the more flavor they absorbed. The beets turned a deep magenta, and the onions absorbed the beet color and turned pink. The pickling brine was tangy and sweet, and the vegetables stayed crunchy even after days in the refrigerator. The process of making pickled beets and onions was simple but required patience. You'd start by boiling whole beets, skin on, until they were tender when pierced with a knife. This took about 40 minutes for medium beets. Once they cooled enough to handle, you'd slip off the skins, they'd slide right off under running water, then slice the beets into rounds about a 1/4 inch thick. Meanwhile, you'd slice white or yellow onions into thin rings, the thinner the better, so they'd absorb the brine quickly. The brine was a balance of sweet and sour. You'd combine white vinegar, sugar, salt, whole cloves, and a cinnamon stick in a pot and bring it to a boil. The house would smell incredible, sharp from the vinegar, sweet from the sugar, warm from the spices. Once the sugar dissolved, you'd pour the hot brine over the beets and onions packed into a jar or bowl. The heat from the brine would soften the onions slightly and help the vegetables start absorbing flavor immediately. After cooling to room temperature, the jar would go into the refrigerator for at least 24 hours. During that time, the beets would release their color into the brine, turning everything a vibrant pink red. The onions would turn from white to magenta, and they'd lose their sharp, raw bite, becoming sweet and tangy. The longer the vegetables pickled, the better they tasted. 3 days was ideal, and they'd keep for 2 weeks in the fridge. The genius of pickled beets and onions was how they cleansed your palate between bites of heavy food. Thanksgiving dinner is rich and filling. Turkey, gravy, stuffing, mashed potatoes, buttered rolls. Everything is savory, fatty, and heavy. Pickled beets provided a burst of acidity that made everything else taste better. The vinegar cut through the richness, the sweetness balanced the salt, and the cold temperature was refreshing after hot food. 1 bite of pickled beets, and your palate was reset, ready for the next round. Pickled beets and onions disappeared when pickled vegetables in general became less popular in the 1980s. The dish was seen as old-fashioned and too tangy. Younger generations grew up eating milder foods, and the sharp acidity of pickled vegetables wasn't appealing. By the 1990s, the only pickled vegetables most Americans ate were cucumber pickles on hamburgers. The tradition of serving pickled beets, pickled eggs, and pickled onions at holiday dinners died out, surviving only in traditional German-American and Scandinavian-American families. But pickled beets and onions are a perfect Thanksgiving side for several reasons. First, they're make-ahead. You make them a week before Thanksgiving and forget about them until dinner. Second, they're a palate cleanser. After eating rich, heavy food, a forkful of tangy, pickled vegetables is exactly what you need. Third, they're beautiful. The deep magenta color adds a pop of brightness to the Thanksgiving table. Fourth, they're cheap. A jar of pickled beets and onions costs about $5 to make. $3 for beets, $1 for onions, $1 for vinegar and sugar. That jar feeds 8 to 10 people, and leftovers keep for 2 weeks. Betty Crocker's recipe is the classic, but you can adapt it. Use red onions instead of white for a deeper color. Add bay leaves or peppercorns to the brine for extra flavor. Use apple cider vinegar instead of white vinegar for a mellower acidity. Some families added hard-boiled eggs to the jar, which would turn pink and become pickled eggs, a bonus snack. The base recipe is flexible and the result is always delicious. If you've never had pickled beets and onions, this Thanksgiving is the year to try them. Make a jar this week. Let it sit in the fridge. Serve it on Thanksgiving Day in a small bowl next to the turkey. Watch as people who think they hate beets try one bite and reach for more. This is the dish that brings balance to your Thanksgiving table. And it's been forgotten for 40 years. Pick one of these 30 sides and make it for Thanksgiving this year. Just one. Try scalloped oysters or creamed onions or sweet potato puff. Try something your grandmother made. Bring it to your Thanksgiving table and see what happens. Let me know in the comments which one you're making, and if you want 30 more forgotten Betty Crocker Thanksgiving recipes, I'll see you in the next video.